It has to plus verb. It has to die. It has to stop. It has to be fair. It has to be hot. It has to be fair. It has to be big. It has to go well. It has to be true. It has to be fast. It has to be said. It has to be safe. It has to be fake. It has to be born. It has to be dark. It has to be slow. It has to happen. It has to be sour. It has to be salty. It has to be cold. It has to be loud. It has to be tasty. It has to be easy. It has to be quiet. It has to be fixed. It has to be seen. It has to be done. It has to be bland. It has to be sweet. It has to be bitter. It has to be loved. It has to be found. It has to be a joke. It has to be bright. It has to start now. It has to be added. It has to be helpful. It has to be certain. It has to be valued. It has to be tamed. It has to be simple. It has to be logical. It has to be boring. It has to be known. It has to be hidden. It has to be earned. It has to be known. It has to be praised. It has to be natural. It has to be shared. It has to be chaotic. It has to be chosen. It has to be divided. It has to be learned. It has to be divided. It has to be serious. It has to be truthful. It has to be forgiven. It has to be created. It has to be ignored. It has to be avoided. It has to be learned. It has to be artificial. It has to be adapted. It has to be rejected. It has to be planned. It has to be nurtured. It has to be rejected. It has to be planned. It has to be nurtured. It has to be beautiful. It has to be believed. It has to be rejected. It has to be believed. It has to be rejected. It has to be selected. It has to be forgiven. It has to be criticized. It has to be tolerated. It has to be complex. It has to be defeated. It has to be resolved. It has to be a priority. It has to be forgotten. It has to be punished. It has to be authentic. It has to be profitable. It has to be criticized. It has to be uncertain. It has to be accepted. It has to be opposed. It has to be accepted. It has to be forgotten. It has to be improved. It has to be balanced. It has to be expected. It has to be accepted. It has to be mourned. It has to be legalized. It has to be forgotten. It has to make sense. It has to be permitted. It has to be restricted. It has to be multiplied. It has to be achieved. It has to be punished. It has to be corrected. It has to be multiplied. It has to be respected. It has to be protected. It has to be rewarded. It has to be expensive. It has to be preserved. It has to be supported. It has to be controlled. It has to be observed. It has to be organized. It has to be neglected. It has to be destroyed. It has to be respected. It has to be supported. It has to be affordable. It has to be cherished. It has to be prolonged. It has to be interesting. It has to be embraced. It has to be controlled. It has to be unleashed. It has to be restrained. It has to be regulated. It has to be satisfying. It has to be dismissed. It has to be prohibited. It has to be subtracted. It has to be celebrated. It has to be successful. It has to be discovered. It has to be addressed. It has to be informative. It has to be celebrated. It has to be questioned. It has to be anticipated. It has to be conquered. It has to be considered. It has to be abandoned. It has to be understood. It has to be educational. It has to be entertaining. It has to be appreciated. It has to be condemned. It has to be challenging. It has to be light-hearted. It has to be disregarded. It has to be encouraged. It has to be transformed. It has to be experienced. It has to be discouraged. It has to be remembered. It has to be spontaneous.